Today we're going to talk about how to sew a button back on a shirt. A button fell off my shirt and it's a useful skill to have. I usually just get out the sewing machine, but the material on the shirt I was using is a little finer, and I'm worried that if I use the sewing machine it's just going to punch a hole through it, and then if it rips off again I won't be able to repair it. So let's see how you would hand sew a button onto a shirt. Let's run through what you're going to need to sew your button back on. First off, hopefully you saved the button that fell off. If you didn't, find one that's similar. You want to look at the hole pattern. This one has 4 holes on it. Some buttons have 2 holes, and you want the button to be the same size. So, hopefully you're going to match it. Next, you're going to need some needles. This isn't the best sewing kit, to be honest with you. These are mainly darning needles, but there is a small needle in here. Probably it would be better to get a fine needle for the material that we're doing, but there's a small needle in here which just fell out. That's what we're going to use today. The next thing is having the ability to thread the needles. Now, as you get older, your eyes don't work so well. You can get a little needle threader like this, and this will pull the thread in through the needle. You want some thread that's going to match the material that you're using, both in color and hopefully in texture. I chose a silk thread, silk and cotton thread. A pin cushion is useful too. You can put your needle in there so it doesn't disappear, and anything else. And you'll need a fine pair of scissors for cutting the thread. Also, a thimble helps to stop you sticking needles in the end of your fingers. Let's take a look at the shirt where the button came out. Really what we want to do is sew the button on in the same place. So we'll clean all the thread up around here and hopefully use roughly the same holes so we get the same button position. You can use your fine scissors to cut away loose threads, but be really careful of the fabric of the shirt. If you cut into that, you're going to ruin the shirt. You can pull out loose threads. Usually they'll just come loose. If you get really stuck, then a seam ripper can be quite useful. If you use a seam ripper, be really careful to not get into the fabric of the shirt. Measure out a piece of thread that's roughly the length of your arm to the center of your chest and thread your needle. If you have difficulty with this part, using the little needle threader that we saw in the beginning is helpful. Usually cutting the thread with a sharp pair of scissors and just sort of licking the end really helps to get it threaded. So once you've threaded your needle, you're going to pull your thread through so that both ends are even, and you'll wind up with something that's roughly the length of your forearm. It doesn't have to be exact. And then what you're going to do is tie a small knot in the end. So I'm just basically tying the knot here. We just want that to be able to hold our thread as we're starting the repair in the shirt material. We'll come along later and trim this off. It's really just to keep everything together in position. You can add a couple of knots on top of that just to get it a little thicker, and that will stop it pulling through in the repair. I used a thread ripper to clear the old thread from the button, so now it's nice and clean and we're ready to sew it back on. So if we look at the front of the shirt, you're going to see there's 2 layers. We want to pull those layers apart to separate them because we don't want to sew them together. Then we're going to take our needle and come in through the back side of this and locate the holes where the button came out. So I'm going to come in, I'm going to separate the material and then come in through the back side and then pull our thread through near where the holes where the button originally was sewn on. So I'm doing that right now. The goal here is to roughly be using the same holes. Now obviously if those holes were damaged when the button pulled out, you want to go slightly alongside them, but you're trying to get the button in exactly the same position. Then you're going to pull through. You don't want to pull it tight though, because you don't want to dimple the material. So at this point we've come out through where the buttonholes are going to be. There's a little bit of a pull on the material. That's from where the original button pulled out. You can see there's a little bit of a tail, and that's held in place by the knot. And we've come out basically where our buttonhole is. The pull's going to press out later when we press the shirt when we're done. I probably should have done this before I did the repair. So for this next step, what I want to do is create a knot on the top surface where the button's going to go. So essentially the button's going to sit on top of the knot, and that will help create a little bit of separation, and it's going to help hold everything together. So I'm going to come through the old buttonhole and create a loop, and I just gently want to, basically pull that loop closed, and then I'm going to run the needle through that loop to create the knot. So I'm just going to gently pull this tight. I don't want anything to be too tight because I don't want to dimple up or pull on the material. So you go pretty carefully, and of course you're holding the back in at the same time. So I'm going to go through there, pull it tight, maybe go through one more time, and then pull the knot down and dress it. It's not the best looking knot, but there's going to be a button on top of it, so it should look okay. So I'll basically pull it through, dress the knot up so that it looks reasonably tidy, and we'll be ready for the next step. Okay, and there's the knot. So now everything's held together nicely. Okay, so now I'm going to place the button on the thread and start sewing it on using one of the pairs of holes on the button. So we're essentially going to go through each time and come back up the other side. We want to keep the stitching as close as we can, and also each time you come through you want to make sure you pull through all the way. One of the mistakes that it's really easy to make sewing buttons on is you don't pay attention to both sides and you end up with a loop, and we want to avoid that. So using the previous holes as a guide, we want to come through maybe somewhere between 8 and 12 times. You're really just trying to match the amount of thread that's on the other buttons so this one doesn't look out of place. So we're going to come back through the guide holes on the other side and start sewing on the other pair of holes on the button. You might have a diagonal pattern or you might have a cross pattern, so you're trying to match the existing buttons. So the goal here is to sew the button on square, so we want to pay attention to that as we start this off, and then we're just going to loop through somewhere between 8 and 12 times, really just to match the other buttons on the shirt. So we'll go do that and come back and take a look at what's next. Once the button's sewn on nice and square, check you don't have any loops. The last step's going to be to tie the button off. So we want to come through the button onto the back side. So we'll just come through. We're going to pull the thread all the way through. And then when we come through the next time, we're not going to go through one of the buttonholes. So we're going to come through the back, and instead of going through a buttonhole, we're just going to come through the material really close to the stitching, and then basically go through that sort of stem of stitching that's holding the button on. And we want to get right through it in the middle there. Okay, so we came through the stem of the stitching, so now I'm going to take my thread and I'm just going to wrap it around that stem probably about half a dozen times. So we're going to keep it fairly tight, and then we're going to take our needle and take it back through the stem and tie a knot in there. Okay, so I have the needle through the stem and I'm just going to loop my thread around it a couple of times and then gently pull the thread through the stem of the stitching that I did, and that loop is going to give us a nice knot to hold everything on there. So the next step's going to be to hide the thread. So let's take a look at how we do that. to finish tying off, we're going to come back through the thread stem and the back of the placket. You want to make sure that you're not coming through the front, just through the back, and there's going to be one thread just kind of hanging there. Okay, our button is nicely secure now. You can get that a good tug. Looks good. It's standing off a little bit, so I've got room to button it. And then here's the original nub that we had. Okay. And then what I did was I pushed the needle through the stitching and then underneath, coming out on the back side. So, and you can see here, it just comes out there. So what we're going to do is very carefully, because you don't want to cut into the material, cut these away. Okay, so we're going to get this one, and snip, snip. Don't want to cut the material in the shirt. And I'm going to do the same over here on the needle one. Okay, snip, snip. Okay. And then I'm just going to work these two nubs back into the material and they'll disappear. And then that way you've got something actually holding your knots together, you're not pulling it away, and with a bit of luck, it's going to hold. So there's our button on this side. I like this side. I need to do a little bit of work on the accuracy coming in the back on this side. Now you can use a machine for this. The problem is, on a good shirt, and this is a shirt that I like and it's quite fine material, the machine is going to punch holes in. And if the button pulls out again, you're just going to end up with a hole in the fabric. You don't really want that, so it's a good idea to hand sew it. Okay, so that's how we sew a button on a shirt. Thanks for joining us, and if you like this content, please like and subscribe.